The Sony A7 Mark III has been one of the best-selling mirrorless cameras of the last few years. It was considered groundbreaking upon its release in 2018 and regarded as a professional camera at an affordable price. But should you still consider this camera right now? Is it still as groundbreaking as it was in 2018? And can it compete with all the other amazing cameras that are on the market at the moment? Well, in this video, we're going to take a good look at the Sony A7 Mark III. I'll share some of my experiences with this camera and talk about the pros and the cons. And by the end of the video, you'll know whether or not this camera is still worth it today. I've been using the Sony A7 Mark III for over 3 years now, and I've taken thousands of photos and videos with it. Everything from street photography to landscape, astrophotography, portraits, and product photography. Almost everything that you see on this channel has been filmed with this camera. It has traveled all around the world with me, and it's safe to say I've put it through its paces. When Sony first released this camera, it was a total game changer for the mirrorless camera industry. It was considered to be Sony's all-rounder camera, so it's good at photo and it's good at video, but it's not necessarily specialized in either of them. Whereas the Sony S series is more focused on video and the Sony R series is more focused on photography. However, that doesn't mean that the specs of the A7 Mark III disappoint. It offers great image quality with its 24 megapixel full-frame CMOS sensor that captures beautiful detailed photos and videos. It also has excellent low-light performance thanks to its expansive ISO range. I've used it a lot for astrophotography, but even nighttime video for vlogs or filming the Northern Lights. So these are situations where I'm bumping up the ISO as high as 25,600 and it still performs really well. The autofocus is very fast and accurate. It has eye autofocus and animal eye autofocus, which could be very interesting if you're into wildlife photography. It can shoot 10 frames per second, so again, it's good for wildlife or sports photography. Of course, it's also good for landscape photography or portraits. And in terms of video, the A7 Mark III is also a really good performer. It has in-body image stabilization. It captures 4K video up to 30 frames per second and Full HD up to 120 frames per second. So very good for slow motion material. However, this is also a negative for this camera, and I'll explain that in a second. Besides that, this camera has a dual card slot, which I think is really great. It doesn't just offer you more capacity, but you can, for example, also separate your video files from your photo files. And this is a feature that not all other cameras offer. So there's no doubt that the Sony A7 Mark III is a very capable camera and even a strong player for professional video and photography. And I'll mention some more great features that the Sony A7 Mark III has to offer. But first, let's talk about the bad stuff, because I might really love this camera, but it's definitely not perfect. The most annoying thing and what I really dislike on this camera is the lack of a flip screen. For example, if you're taking video of yourself, you have no way of checking your framing or what your shot looks like. But even when you're doing photography, if your camera is at a lower angle and you're shooting vertically, it's such a pain to properly check your screen. Really, I can't understand why this camera doesn't have a flip screen. So like I mentioned before, the Sony A7 Mark III offers 4K video up to 30 frames per second and Full HD up to 120 frames per second. However, newer cameras offer 4K up to 120 frames per second, which of course is going to give you higher quality slow motion. Besides that, the Sony A7 Mark III only offers 8-bit color, whereas newer cameras offer 10-bit color. Of course, this is only really important if you need that extra quality for a more professional production. Another common complaint is the complicated menu system. The Sony A7 Mark III has the older Sony menu system, and it is a bit complex, messy, and quite difficult to navigate at first. So especially in the beginning, you'll need some time to get used to the menu and find your way in there. But when you get through the initial setup of the camera, and after using it for a while, I really don't think that it's a huge pain point. A few other minor things that could be better on this camera are, for example, the stabilization. I mentioned it as a positive because it has stabilization, but it's not the absolute best. Especially if you compare it to newer models, it could be a lot better. Of course, these newer models come at a much higher price, and I'll talk about that in a second. Also, the back LCD screen could be higher resolution and better quality. In bright daylight, it gets hard to see anything on the screen, and I would say, especially if you're planning to do a lot of video with this camera, it would be nice to get a secondary monitor. Now, these are not huge pain points for me personally, but definitely things to consider. So let's move on to some more positives on this camera. The build quality, for example, is really great. This camera is weather sealed, which as a landscape and outdoor photographer, I really appreciate a lot. Like I said, I've used this camera all over the world, and when it rains, when it snows, when it's dusty, it doesn't really matter. And overall, this camera just feels really solid. Also, the battery life on these Z batteries is incredible. For the past 3 years, I've only been carrying around 2 of these batteries, and I've literally never ever run out of battery. And this is even using my camera in extremely cold temperatures like -30, where other batteries would get drained very quickly. And let's not forget the incredible amount of lenses you currently have available for the Sony E-mount system. And on top of that, there are even more great third-party lenses like Sigma, Samyang, Tamron, and so on. And that actually brings me to a very important point to consider. I would argue that it sometimes makes more sense to invest in a better lens than in a better body, because often the sharpness or the certain look you might want to get comes primarily from the lens and not from the body. So now that we're on the topic of spending money, let's talk about the price of the A7 Mark III. Because the price of this camera makes it incredibly accessible if you're looking to get a full-frame mirrorless camera without breaking the bank. At the moment, the A7 Mark III will set you back about 2,000 euros when you buy it new. And that's definitely not cheap, especially if you then look at the A7 Mark IV, which is only about 400 to 500 euros more. It could be more interesting to get that one if you have the budget. But wait, here's the thing. Because the A7 Mark III is a slightly older model, a lot of shops frequently offer discounts, and Sony often offers cashbacks, so you can easily find this camera under 2,000 euros. But where it gets really interesting is the second-hand market. Because like I said, this camera has been one of the best-selling cameras in the past few years. You can find a lot of second-hand offers. And sometimes you can find this camera even under 1,500 euros with a lens, and that's a very good deal. So the money that you're then saving in comparison to buying a Sony A7 Mark IV, you can spend on other lenses, which I think is a pretty good deal. And that is where the A7 Mark III really wins. There's no other camera out there in the price range of the Sony A7 Mark III that performs as well and has all the specs that this camera has. So should you still consider buying the Sony A7 Mark III right now? Well, it really comes down to your needs, how high the quality of your final product needs to be, and most importantly, your budget. This is a really good camera. It was once the best hybrid camera on the market, and even now it's more than capable of delivering fantastic results. So if you're coming from an older model, or you've been using a crop sensor or a DSLR, and you want to upgrade to a full-frame mirrorless camera without breaking the bank, then I think the A7 Mark III is a great option, especially if you want to take your photography a little bit further and you want to dabble in videography. I think this camera has got what you need. But in saying that, the mirrorless camera market has expanded so much, and there are some really insane cameras out there that without doubt will outperform the A7 Mark III. So if you really want the best quality out there right now, then you should probably be looking somewhere else and save up for a little while longer. Alright, that's my 2 cents on the Sony A7 Mark III. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!